monthly PJLA webinar on topics of interest in 17025. Today we're going to be talking about critical issues related to the purchasing function. This has application to both calibration and testing laboratories. Also, reference material providers will find it applicable to them as well. We'll go ahead and begin at this time. Those who are attending the webinar today will discover what the purchasing procedure in section 4.6 applies to. They'll also find what it doesn't apply to. They'll see what activities are identified or implied in the purchasing procedure and how the requirements of the purchasing function or activity interact with other requirements of the 17025 standard. The last thing we'll talk about are accessible elements of the purchasing function. We'll begin with what the purchasing procedure must apply to. So those things which are detailed in section 4.6 apply to services or supplies that affect the quality of the work performed. In other words, if the equipment that you're purchasing, the services for equipment that you're purchasing, or supplies that are being purchased for use in performing the calibrations and tests for which the laboratory is accredited, if those results can be affected by those services or products that are being purchased, then the purchasing procedure of 4.6 applies and has to be applied. Calibration and measurement equipment in the laboratory, test equipment and so forth, is affected by this procedure. Machines or measurement systems, things that are more complex than just simple instruments, measuring instruments or test instruments, but that which is more complex and comprises a measurement system is also subject to this purchasing procedure. Instruments, standards, those things that you use as transfer standards or to make comparisons to items that are being tested or calibrated. Certified reference materials that are used in the performance of specific tests or calibrations. Subcontracted tests or calibrations. The previous section of the standard deals with subcontracting test or calibration activities, but the purchasing function and its relation to the use of subcontractors is dealt with in 4.6. Accreditation services. When you think about it, the services afforded you in your laboratories by organizations such as ours, such as PJLA, affect the quality of the test results or calibration results that you produce, because it's through the accreditation process that traceability of those results is established. So your interaction with your accrediting body is also a function that has to be addressed, or that is addressed, by the purchasing procedure referenced in section 4.6. Now we want to talk briefly about what it doesn't apply to. It doesn't, obviously, if it applies only to services and supplies that affect the quality of the work, by definition, it wouldn't apply to services or supplies that don't affect the quality of the work. There are a number of purchased items and purchased services that organizations would acquire through their purchasing function that have nothing at all or no relation to the quality of work performed. Those, the purchase of those kinds of items is independent then of this purchasing procedure. It may be contained in your purchasing procedure, but it's not an accessible element because it doesn't affect the quality of the work that you do, the test and measurement results. For instance, office supplies and equipment would not be items that you would have to take into account and apply your accredited purchasing procedure to, with the exception of specifically identified and required equipment that is documented in your quality management system or that is required by specific customer requirements. And these would be requirements that are over and above or in excess of the requirements of the standard. Say if a customer wanted their reports generated on a very specific printer that you have, perhaps they want them in color. As an example, if you had customers who wanted color reports, you would probably put a color printer in the lab. But using this as an example, if you did not, if your lab printers were black and white and a customer wanted a report in color, then you would use that particular piece of equipment and your purchasing procedure would apply to it for ink cartridges and so forth. Cleaning and maintenance supplies. For instance, laboratories, almost all organizations will have rolls of paper towels that people will use to dry their hands. And unless you're in a food testing lab or something like this where there might be requirements that you use material for hand towels that doesn't contain particular materials or particular chemicals, in those cases, if there was that kind of a requirement, that would have to be addressed under the purchasing procedure. But typically, window cleaner, hand soap, paper towels, detergents that are used for mopping the floors and so forth, those kinds of things are independent of the purchasing procedure that forms part of your quality management system. Same with maintenance supplies. Subcontracted services. Now this is different from subcontracted measurements and calibrations. This would be things such as cleaning services, delivery services, landscape services. Delivery services and possibly cleaning services, you would have to look at these from a standpoint of the necessity of protecting confidentiality, and you would have to make sure that you weren't creating circumstances or situations where confidentiality of customer equipment could be compromised by having personnel from outside contract services in the laboratory, especially if they're in there at off hours. So how you would use a cleaning service would have to be addressed in your quality management system. But it probably would not have to be addressed in the purchasing function because, again, it does not affect the quality of the work. Delivery services, much the same way. If you use a delivery service for delivery of tested materials or calibrated instruments, certainly there is an impact on the quality of the work that you do based on how it's handled in transport. So that is the area in which it might have to be addressed, but simply using a delivery service for UPS shipments or for mailing invoices and such, that would not affect the quality of the work, and in that regard would not have to be addressed through your purchasing procedure as part of your quality management system. We talked in the issue of elements that did have to be addressed by the purchasing procedure, and accreditation services was one. Now we're talking about things that don't have to be addressed, and registration services would not. For instance, if an organization is registered to ISO 9000 and also accredited to 17025, the purchasing procedure should identify the accrediting body as one element that affects the quality of the test and measurement results, again, because the traceability of those results is established through the accreditation process, which is managed by the accrediting body. Registration has no bearing whatsoever on the accreditation process, and so your quality management system, as it relates to the 17025 accredited activities, has no interest whatsoever in the registration status or the registration services. The only way in which that would need to be addressed is if, in the eyes of a particular auditor or perhaps some unusual standard that had requirements that conflicted with the requirements of 17025, that would need to be noted, and the requirements of 17025 would take precedence. It would not be a problem if a secondary standard of some type to which the organization was registered had requirements that were more stringent than those of 17025. That doesn't diminish the quality of the work. If anything, it might enhance it. But you certainly can defend the position that it doesn't degrade the results. So in that instance, it wouldn't be a problem. But if there was a requirement, for instance, in some other standard beyond 17025 that affected traceability and yet was mandatory in the other standard, that could not supersede the requirements in 17025 to establish a chain of traceability to the international system of units and to express that traceability and evidence that traceability on calibration and test results as necessary. Activities identified or implied in the purchasing procedure. Some are directly identified, but there are also some which are simply implied. It doesn't specifically say that you have to do things, but what it does require you to do either is predicated on these other things being done or implies that other activities are necessary. And we'll talk about one of those in particular when we come to it. And it's not a terribly important point because it's logical. When you see it, you'll understand. So there's no real necessity to say that it has to happen. The very first thing that happens in the purchasing process is that somewhere along the line there's the identification of the need for services or supplies. This is implied in 4.6. Nowhere does it say that this happens, but what it does begin with is the response to this having happened. So the implication is there that this took place. And before I go further, I'd like to say that we're trying something a little bit different today. In the past, we have used the first 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes of the webinar to present information. Then we would pause and take questions. We're asking today that you enter your questions through the notepad at the bottom of the screen. It's the chat box that you enter your questions. We will be collecting those here in the office as they're coming in, and at 1:45, we are going to take a few moments, as we have in the past, and we're going to gather those, and then we will come back on after a moment or two away from the mic, and we will address those so that the entire group can hear them. If you have, in the final 15 minutes while that's taking place, if you have follow-up questions, you can attempt to enter those, and if we get those and have adequate time to respond, we will. If not, please email those to us at the email address we will post at the end of the session, and we will respond to those offline. So again, be going ahead right now. If you have questions, feel free to go ahead and communicate those through the chat box, and we'll be gathering those during the first 45 minutes and begin shortly thereafter with responding to them. Okay, we have the implied action that's taking place. Someone in the laboratory identifies the need for services or supplies. If this is a technician, perhaps he is using some reference materials, perhaps some chemicals, perhaps calibrating a pH meter with standard pH solutions, and he notices that the bottles are getting low and they need to replenish the reference materials. So he would bring that to someone's attention, or the laboratory would have a process by which he would make known the fact that the need existed to obtain excuse me, to obtain the reference materials. Once that need is made known, then the next activity is requisition of the needed services or supplies. And I want to say at this point that in many labs, all of these activities are taking place through the efforts of the same individual. laboratories oftentimes don't have large staffs, 24 technicians and half a dozen management and administrative people. So oftentimes the person who uses the material is the person who notices that replacements are necessary, and the person who makes the call or sends a purchase order to a supplier of those materials. So I understand that oftentimes this might be the same person or limited to a small number of people, perhaps only 2. But the standard recognizes functions, and your system, your documentation has to address the functional requirements, even if those actually all are merged into the activities of one person. So try to keep that in mind, that although perhaps in your laboratory, when we talk about different elements of this process, that we recognize that they may all be you, or they may all be one person in your laboratory. So we have at first the implied identification of a need. Next is the requisition of needed services or supplies. Then preparation of the purchasing documents. And the reason this is separated because there's a follow-up activity that is going to come here. Review of purchasing documents by the designated authority. The standard doesn't say that this has to be the person who requisitioned the service or the supplies, but it does have to be someone who is designated to do this activity. So the requisition of material is the first physical activity. Someone notices that there's a need for replacement supplies or calibration services. That's brought to the attention of someone who begins the process by requisitioning the appropriate supplies or calibration services. That generates a purchasing document. That document has to be reviewed by a designated authority. The order is placed for the necessary services or supplies. The supplies are received, the supplies or services. The documentation that comes with purchased material, or the documentation that comes representing the fulfillment of services, such as calibration, are reviewed when the supplies are delivered or the service is completed. Now we're going to look at these individuals, these activities. We're going to look at them individually. The requisition of needed services or supplies takes place again. Someone recognizes that either a calibration is approaching expiration. Oftentimes this is done by computer software that alerts the laboratory when accreditation cycles are nearing expiration, so that the service can be requisitioned and there's no interruption in availability of calibrated equipment. And again, this may be a separate activity from preparing the purchase order, or it may be coincidental with the preparation of the purchase order. In other words, a separate written requisition may not actually exist, but the knowledge that supplies or services are needed may be, rather than noted on a requisition, this may be that which generates the formal purchase order directly. And that would be the case in many smaller labs with small staffs, small administrative staffs. This activity should be in the responsibility of the technical manager or someone that he designates to do so. And that's based on the requirement found in section 4.1.5 of the standard. The laboratory shall have technical management which has overall responsibility for the technical operations and the provision of resources needed to ensure the required quality of laboratory operations. Now, the fact that there is a responsibility for provision of resources implies some level of spending authority granted to the technical manager. If the technical manager has as part of his responsibility maintaining operation of the lab, maintaining operation of the equipment so that the ability to perform tests or calibrations is not interrupted, oftentimes that's going to require planned maintenance activities, such as calibration of the equipment. It's also going to require the ability to respond to almost instantaneous events that happen that perhaps take a piece of equipment out of service, and that would require maintenance, repairs, recalibration, and so forth. And within the responsibilities of the technical manager is the requirement to maintain the operation of the laboratory. And as I said, that implies some level of spending authority be granted to the technical manager, specifically as compared to other managerial people or the laboratory manager, for instance. Now let's look at preparation of the purchasing documents. The person authorized to perform the purchasing function will prepare the purchasing document. This will be a purchase order or some kind of equivalent document. I refer to it through this presentation as a purchase order, but laboratories can call this whatever they wish. This purchasing document, though, will be based on the requisition. Again, understanding that oftentimes it's the same person, but think of this in terms of the individual functions, and if it helps to visualize that, think of independent people, individual people, fulfilling each of those functions. So we have a situation where the need for supplies or calibration services is identified. That is brought to the attention of someone with authorization to spend the money to acquire supplies or services. That person writes a requisition describing in a technical sense what the supplies are or what the service is that's needed, and that then is handed to a person with authorization to purchase or procure services or supplies. That generates the document, the purchase order. This person with purchasing authority will select a suitable supplier to obtain the services or supplies, and he will do so utilizing the approved supplier list. Now, the approved supplier list, again, could be called a number of things. It could be called an approved vendor list. Anything the laboratory wishes to call it, but it has to be fulfilling the role that's defined here in section 4.6.4 of the standard. It says the laboratory shall evaluate suppliers of critical consumables, supplies, and services which affect the quality of testing and calibration, and shall maintain records of these evaluations and list those approved. These last four words, and list those approved, is the basis for developing an approved supplier list, an approved vendor list, or whatever you might choose to call it. But it's a requirement in 4.64. Only four words referred to it, but those four words are the basis on which the requirement to have it is based. You also have to record the evaluations. You have to have, your procedure has to say how you qualify suppliers or vendors to be on the approved supplier or approved vendor list. That has to be part of your procedure, and you have to list those approved, which again is the approved supplier list. Let's assume that a laboratory has multiple vendors or suppliers for a particular service or supply. The person with purchasing authority, the implication is that that person has the option to select from any of the approved suppliers of the particular service or supply that he chooses. And that leaves him free to consider issues that are not necessarily related to the quality of the measured results or the test results which the laboratory is interested in. So the laboratory qualifies suppliers basically on their ability to provide, if it's calibration with traceable results. If it's reference materials, it's reference materials that will be traceable. So the laboratory is interested in qualifying suppliers on that basis. The purchasing agent, on the other hand, or the individual who does all these things, when he looks at where to purchase it, he may look at where can I get this approved service for the lowest price. or where can I get it the quickest, of maybe 3 or 4 different potential suppliers, all who are approved. Which one of them can meet these non-quality related parameters such as price and delivery? So the implication, again, it's not stated specifically, but the implication is that if they have been placed on the approved supplier list in accordance with a procedure for qualifying them, then when it's time to select who do we obtain this from, you can obtain it from anyone on that list, and you can apply then to those who are qualified parameters that aren't quality related. Again, price and delivery being some ones that would come to mind. Now, once we've gotten a requisition and then we've got a purchase order issued, not distributed or released, but issued, prepared, now that purchase order has to be reviewed. The purchase order will be reviewed for technical content by a person with documented authority to do so. This might be the person who generated it. It may be someone totally different, but it needs to be designated in your procedure who this person is. It is a mandatory required activity that once the purchase document has been prepared, it has to be examined and evaluated for technical content. The objective of this review is to see that the services or supplies needed have been adequately defined to ensure that the supplier will provide the desired services or supplies. It doesn't help if the description on the purchase order is vague or unclear to the point that the person issued the purchase order, the supplier from your approved supplier list, can't understand what you are specifying and provides you with the wrong item. Obviously, it's intended that you would find that you have obtained the wrong supplies or the wrong service and would not use the supplies or make use of equipment for which the service has been provided. But there's a requirement in the standard that to minimize as much as possible the likelihood that that would happen, the purchase document, once it's prepared and before it's issued to a vendor, has to be examined by a person designated to do so for technical content. And then they have to approve it. The best way to approve that would be perhaps they initial or sign their signature to the purchase order or to the copy that a company would retain, the laboratory that is would retain. So there's a record that yes, it's been approved, it's been examined and approved, possibly dated and sign it. But the point for laboratories to recognize and remember is the responsibility is yours to build into your procedure the method defining how this is done. How is this approval performed, and how is it documented? And as I said, I would suggest that they sign and date a copy of the purchase order indicating that they've approved it. If the service to be obtained is calibration, the focus of this review might be items such as, is the service provider accredited for the calibration requested? Obviously, you can't use them for an accredited calibration if this is either not on their scope or if it exceeds the ranges on their scope for which they're accredited. Is the service provider's accredited range adequate? Is the CMC of the service provider adequate? If you are going to be performing calibration for customers that are expecting an upper limit to the measurement uncertainty, you would select your calibration service provider on the basis of who has an appropriate CMC. You're going to anticipate that the actual uncertainty of the calibration is larger than the CMC, but typically not by a large amount, but it will be larger. So if there are a variety of magnitudes among the multiple vendors on your approved supplier list, you would probably pick the one that had the lowest CMC in the area in which you were seeking calibration. If several of them could satisfy your accuracy requirement and had CMCs low enough to be acceptable, then you would probably pick the one that you would use based on how soon could the calibration be performed if time was critical. but you would perhaps eliminate several and keep several and pick from the remaining ones based on either price or availability of services and supplies. Next thing you might look at for calibration is the equipment used by the service provider appropriate? Not all calibration methods are satisfactory for all end users because of the fact that oftentimes laboratories need the highest level of measurement uncertainty, which would be the smallest uncertainty values, so it would require them to use laboratories that have the most precise, least uncertain equipment. So those would be things that would be the subject of the review. The person making the technical review would know what the requirements of the laboratory are for the specific work that they're trying to do and would evaluate the purchase order accordingly. Obviously, these kinds of pieces of information should be addressed in the requisition so that the purchasing person making the selection from the approved supplier list has all the information that they need in order to not select an unacceptable provider. Again, they may have the option of picking from several, but they need to be given all the necessary information to make sure that the one that they do select, and perhaps again they may consider non-quality related parameters, but in considering those as well as the quality related parameters, making sure that the selection they make is acceptable. And again, that's confirmed by a documented person or a person with documented authority reviewing it. Now, if it wasn't calibration, but instead it was supplies to be obtained, perhaps certified reference materials, the focus of the review then might shift from the numeric kind of things we're talking about with measurement uncertainty and ranges and so on. They might be looking at the uncertainty of the percentage of constituent materials in a reference material, perhaps a powder, perhaps a liquid, something of that nature. They also might look at how often do we use this reference material? Does it have a shelf life? If we buy this in a one quantity, are we going to use that much before it would expire to a shelf life consideration? And you would try to buy in quantities such that you would hopefully use it all up just prior to the time that its shelf life expired. But those kind of considerations, depending on what it is that's being purchased, the technical review is considering various and different technical issues. Now we want to talk about the review of the purchased services or supplies and any supporting documentation. Documentation supplied with the delivered services or supplies shall be reviewed to confirm compliance with the technical requirements of the purchase order. This is based on a requirement found in section 4.6.2 of the standard. The laboratory shall ensure that purchased supplies and reagents and consumable materials, now bear in mind, this does not include services. It's supplies, reagents, and consumable materials that affect the quality of tests and their calibrations are not used until they have been inspected or otherwise verified as complying with standard specifications or requirements defined in the methods for the test and or calibrations concerned. So if you're doing tests or if you're doing calibrations on materials that are consumable by nature, chemical reagents, or just purchase supplies of some particular type, this is not a service, this is a supply of some type. So what it says in this sentence applies only to those kinds of purchased items, not purchased services, although purchased services are addressed here very shortly. These services and supplies used shall comply with specified requirements. The source for these specified requirements should be reflected in the requisition that generated the purchase order. And if it's an organization where the requisition and the purchase order essentially are the same document, then the knowledge of what these specifications are should have been incorporated into the decisions made in specifying specific things on the purchase order. Records of actions taken to check compliance shall be maintained. This means when you receive supplies of any kind, be they reagents, be they consumable materials. If they are the type of materials that are controlled by the purchasing procedure, in other words, they affect the quality of test and calibration results, then they have to be confirmed upon arrival, and this is done through study of documentation. Oftentimes, always, with any kind of standard reference material, standard or calibrated material, calibrated equipment, you will get documentation of some kind. And if you're buying, for instance, the solutions, the pH standard solutions for pH testing, they will come with a sheet of paper detailing what they contain and what the pH is and how the pH was determined. It will reference standards that specify how that material is to be prepared, and the laboratory is responsible for making sure that the information reported to them satisfies the reporting requirements of the accreditation or the oversight body that is responsible for authorizing the production of certified reference materials. On the other hand, now, if it's a calibration, you don't get a packing slip on a calibration. You get a calibration certificate. Those of you who issue calibration certificates from your laboratory, as opposed to test reports, are aware of the complexity of information that has to be on the certificate. Test reports are equally as complex, but they contain a slightly different set of information. They address information that is provided in a slightly different way. For instance, with regard to measurement uncertainty on a calibration certificate and measurement uncertainty on a test report. Test reports deal with detection limits as well, where calibration essentially does not. But the point is that whether it's a testing certificate, whether it's a calibration certificate that your laboratories are issuing, there's a fairly significant amount of information that has to be presented, and it has to be presented in a very specific way. But for both testing and calibration laboratories, you have equipment that's calibrated and you receive calibration certificates. So today we're going to be kind of zeroing in on the fact that calibration certificates issued to your laboratories have to be evaluated as part of the 4.62 requirement. The way that you evaluate them is by knowledge of the 5.10 section of the standard, which defines what has to be included. 5.10.2 and 5.10.4 identify things that are unique to calibration certificates and have to be contained on them. 5.3 applies to test reports, but we're not talking about those today. Unless your lab has equipment tested and you're receiving a test report, but your laboratories in all likelihood are performing tests and issuing test reports, and you're receiving calibration certificates when you have your equipment calibrated. So bear in mind that every time you get a calibration certificate, most of you make note of that. Perhaps you note it on the certificate when you received it, and you file it. So it's available for your assessor, it's available for customers, it's available for any parties interested in determining that your equipment is in fact in the current state of calibration. But you do have a responsibility to confirm the calibration certificate, and it's a pretty in-depth determination. There are, excuse me, there are essentially 31 unique questions that you have to ask yourself and obtain answers to relative to a calibration certificate. Now, some of these are mutually exclusive with one another. So if you answer yes to one question, that automatically eliminates the need to consider the other. But if you answer no, then perhaps the later question becomes valid and applicable at that time. That's going to be a topic for a future webinar, by the way, is specifically how to do that and specifically what the questions are that you need to obtain answers to. But this is an activity that laboratories need to do and need to be very rigorous in doing. And it isn't only with calibration certificates. It's with all of the documentation that is intended to provide you information that establishes that the use of equipment that is calibrated or the use of materials that you use in the performance of calibrations or tests, be that reagents or standard reference materials, certified reference materials of a variety of different types. It's necessary for your labs to confirm that what you have carefully specified in the purchase order is in fact what you did receive, and that its performance, when it was evaluated, calibrated, tested, or whatever, yielded results that are within the range that you need them to be. Okay, we're pretty quickly getting to the point where we're going to stop and start taking questions, but I'll try to wrap up here. Additional activities reviewing purchase services or supplies. For calibration services, the calibration certificate needs to be examined to determine the following. You want to find out that all required information is present. Now, that information you want to confirm is the information found in section 5.10.2 and 5.10.4. That's identifying specific information that needs to be present on all calibration certificates. You also want to find out that the information present is correct and correctly presented. In other words, you can have information present that is required information, but when you evaluate it, the information that's there is incorrect. Perhaps it's incorrectly stated. Perhaps it's just the wrong information. We'll look at a couple of examples. You want to make sure that there's evidence of traceability, and it needs to be traceability to the SI, not traceability to NIST. You also want to make sure that if the laboratory that performs the calibration, and they would do this at your request, if they make a statement of compliance with a specification, in other words, saying that a piece of equipment is within or without the tolerance of its specification, the standard requires that they take the uncertainty into account when they make those decisions, and you as the customer of those services have a right to say that the manner in which they account for the uncertainty is acceptable to you or it is not. And that is information that needs to be determined prior to the work commencing. So that's something that should be handled in the section 4.4 activities. But this is one area where the laboratory could issue you a certificate that states a piece of equipment is within specification. It may not say in the certificate that they did or did not include the measurement uncertainty. You have to determine that they did because it's necessary that they did, and that they do so in a way that you have had the opportunity to say yes or no to. If they take this into account by a method that you don't accept, you have to have knowledge of that and have the opportunity to reject that, in which case the lab could decide to satisfy your requirement as to how you want this done, or if not, then you would find another calibration source. For supplies, the documentation must confirm that relevant attributes of the materials comply as documented with the requirements defined in the purchasing documents. Now, for supplies, consumables of various natures, the manner in which the results are reported can be drastically different. Most calibration, there's very specific instructions, but the nature of reference materials and the nature of testing is such that there can be a pretty significant difference between what information is reported for one type of material and what's reported for another, and what laboratories do with it when reporting results. Another piece of information, does the laboratory have a procedure? Now this is assessable elements. Does the laboratory have a procedure by which they evaluate potential suppliers? This is what an assessor can be looking at as far as your procedures related to purchasing. All of this relates to section 4.6. So does your laboratory have a procedure by which they evaluate potential suppliers? In other words, how you go about establishing qualification for your approved supplier list. Does the laboratory record those approved? In other words, do you generate an approved supplier list? The assessor will be trying to determine that. They will determine it. Does the laboratory have this list, however named? Does your laboratory have a procedure for the purchase, reception, and storage of relevant reagents and laboratory consumable materials? If you use these types of things, you should have a procedure that defines how you purchase them, what you do as far as receiving activities, confirming that you got what you needed, what you required, and that the documentation that comes with it is correct, complete, and appropriate. How do you store it? Those things need to be specified in your procedure. Are these documents reviewed and approved prior to placing the order? In other words, when the purchase order is written, does someone with technical authority to do so review it to make sure that it's correct in what it's specifying? Does the laboratory maintain records of these confirmations? In other words, when that is confirmed by examination, there needs to be a record of that. And again, a simple way to record it would be to sign and date a copy of the purchase order at the time of approval. Do purchasing documents describe the services or supplies adequately? That's what the review is for, to determine that they do. Does the laboratory ensure that purchase services and supplies meet all expectations prior to use? This is the evaluation at time of receipt. It might be a physical examination of a reference material for size, weight, constituents, color, a variety of different things of that nature. Or it may be a careful analysis of a calibration certificate to make sure that all the requirements of section 5.10.2 and 5.10.4 have been met. Or if they have not, to identify which ones have not, and you can request that those issues be addressed by the calibration laboratory. Okay, we're going to take a brief time for questions here. We're going to take a couple of minutes, and we'll gather the questions that we have, and we'll be back online then very shortly to start trying to respond to those. Thank you. And if you have any more questions that result from our answers to these, as I said, please don't hesitate to email those to us, and we'll respond to them offline. What were you saying when we got cut off? Okay. Okay, we're going to start answering the questions. We have quite a few, so bear with me. First question, what about a server that is considered a backup? In other words, this is a backup for laboratory-generated information. Does that affect quality of work? Do you need to show documentation of the server? My position on that would be no, it doesn't, because at that point you're recording the results of the work, so it doesn't affect the quality of the work. It may, in fact, affect the availability of the work. So you may have a problem in document control that relates to the server, because if that is where you're keeping information and you have, for quality records, for instance, you have a 3-year retention time, and if you have it on a server and something happens to the server so this information is lost, you would have an issue. The assessor would look at that, though, from the standpoint of document control and availability of information over time. Control of records is the issue, probably because of the retention time. So it doesn't corrupt the information as you're gathering it or processing it, but it might compromise the availability of the information down the road. So I would say no. That would not be an item that would fall under the auspices of 4.6. Obviously, it would not hurt if you do, but it would be additional work that really is not required by the standard. What about a spray that is used to air clean the microbiological laboratory? Does that fall under not needed maintenance and cleaning supplies? Do you need an MSDS sheet or a COA for that? I would say you probably absolutely need an MSDS. Without knowing the specific composition of the material, I wouldn't know. If I did know the composition, I could find out, but I could find out no easier than you could. But I would say that absolutely would fall under the auspices of 4.6, because you're using this to clean the air, and you're doing that because if the air isn't clean, it could produce contaminated results. It might cause you to interpret a contaminated result as a valid result that indicated a failure, when in reality it wasn't. So that absolutely, in those circumstances, would be something that would have to fall under the guidelines of 4.6 to make sure that you were specifying the right kind of material, that the right kind of cleaning material was being requested in a purchase order, and then that purchase order would have to be subjected to technical review to make certain that that which was needed by someone knowledgeable in what would be required would be approving the purchase order, and then evaluating what actually was received when it comes in. Okay, next question. What about pest control services and fire extinguishers? Does that apply to the purchasing procedure? If you were working in a laboratory that performed dimensional calibration, then what kind of mouse pellets you put out probably would not be an issue. Indirectly it would be if it eliminated the problem. That would avoid any possible consequences, contamination, corrosion, and so forth that might result from having little furry critters in the laboratory. But again, for a biological laboratory, a food testing laboratory, or something of that nature, it absolutely would have the opportunity to impact the results, and therefore it would have to be included under the guidelines established for 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. 4.9. purchasing procedure apply to routine laboratory supplies that are not used for procedures under the scope of accreditation? I'm not a chemist, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, for instance, if you have a beaker in which you store the bulk of particular chemicals, and then you draw from that specific amounts using calibrated equipment and disperse it throughout other equipment in the course of performing tests or calibrations, that equipment would not have the opportunity to influence the results so long as it was properly cleaned. That would fall under a procedure for how you handled the equipment and how you cleaned it. It would not be affected by a purchasing decision, though. So that would not necessarily be something that would be controlled by 4.6. Let's see. Will this PowerPoint be made available to attendees? All of our presentations are available on our website. It will probably be available later today or certainly within the next day or so. And you can replay it live with comments. So yes, it's available on our website. We asked a question, do we have examples of how to evaluate approved suppliers? We did a webinar presentation on the approved supplier list several months ago. I will note this and go back and see if there's specific information there that I would consider representing an example. I think the entire webinar itself would probably be helpful if you didn't see that one to go back and replay it. But I have your contact information here, and I'll look at that, and if I think that there's something there that I can send you as a worthwhile example, I will. Otherwise, I'll look through other of our materials and see if I can send you something that would be helpful. I'm sure we would have something. Here's a question. What is CMC? Now, this apparently comes from someone not in a calibration laboratory. It's the calibration and measurement capability, which is very quickly and simply, it is an estimate of the best measurement uncertainty that a laboratory is capable of when performing a more or less routine calibration of a nearly ideal device under nearly ideal conditions. And it's meant basically to be a comparison tool that will rate one laboratory's capability against another, so you can find if laboratories are comparable or if you can find that they're dramatically different. And it helps you make selections when having the lowest possible measurement uncertainties for calibrations performed is critical or important to you. How is a review of purchasing documents documented when a PO is not generated? As an example, what about online transactions? If a purchase order is not generated and there's an online transaction, the standard requires that when you're conducting the documentation system or portions of it electronically, you still must satisfy all the requirements of the standard. So let's say that a purchase is conducted online, then there would have to be an online record, or there would have to be a record that you make. You could make the record hard copy, recording who made the purchase, when they made it, where they made it, who it was obtained from, and the individual or the organization you would make that purchase from would have to have been evaluated by the same procedure you use to qualify others to be on your approved supplier list. And if it was calibration service, which doesn't seem like that would be one that would apply here, but you would need to know their accredited status, who they're accredited by, whether or not they are still accredited, what their scope is, the ranges on their scope, and so forth. So the way that you would do this is, a variety of different ways could be used, but you have to devise a procedure that would permit you to do it while still gathering all the information that's necessary to satisfy the requirements of the standard. Okay, we have several questions regarding CMC. That's already been answered, and if anyone needs to know or wants to know more about that, again, please send us an email. I'm going to show you another slide here. This is upcoming training. The next webinar we're going to do is the 28th of this month, and we're going to conduct the measurement traceability webinar again. This is one that had a lot of interest. It's a very critical issue for testing and calibration labs, not only for certificates that you issue that you want to have traceable results for, but traceability of results on calibration certificates that you receive. So we thought this was a very timely topic, and we're going to rerun that one, the 28th. So mark that on your calendar. You can check it on our website at any time. But here's the, let me back up a minute, too far. This is the email address we'd like you to use, webinar@pjlabs.com. You can suggest topics for future webinars if you'd like, or you can submit additional questions to this one. We have, for those who have asked questions, as I said, we have your contact information, and we'll try to respond offline if there's not something we can do for you online. On receiving new solutions, can you verify a standard by using a method blank just before you perform chemical analysis? You can verify to the extent that that type of test will verify it. I also would verify the documentation that comes with it, because you're basically going to be interpreting the results of the test you perform based on what you think the solution is. So you need to confirm the solution from a documentary standpoint, and then if you can provide an independent confirmation of that through chemical analysis, all the better. But you absolutely have to identify to the greatest degree possible that you can know it, what is the constituent of chemical compounds that you've obtained, if that's what you're talking about, is something from the chemical realm. What if our company has a standardized computer purchase order system that does not allow us to put all of the technical details into the purchase order? Still has to be recorded somewhere, and it's still going to be subject to review. That will create difficulty for you in satisfying the requirements of 4.6, but in a nutshell, you're not excused from from complying simply because to do so is difficult. You will probably find that somewhere when this system information is entered into it, it's possible to include this information. It may already be there. So if the information has been entered at some time, and all you're doing is accessing it and telling it, to gather information from specific fields, and it fills it out and places the order, that may have been confirmed with previous data entry. You have to look into that and investigate it. It's basically, the answer would be that there's so many possibilities and so many different options that it's impossible to say. But I will say that however the software operates and however you interact with the software, you are not excused from satisfying or complying with all requirements in the standard, and with regard to purchasing, certainly everything in 4.6. If you have additional problems as you attempt to address that, don't hesitate to call. I or someone else on the staff would be more than happy to discuss it with you, and perhaps we can make specific suggestions to specific questions, but we'd be glad to do that. Are you saying you have to verify independently of receiving the solutions? You have to verify that when you receive the solutions that you got what you had needed. The independent review of the purchase order before it's issued is to make sure that you're asking for that which you need. And then when you receive it, you are required to confirm that what you got is what you expected. You do that through a study of the documentation, and you also, where possible, can confirm that through, again, chemical analysis. This solution in the particular concentrations that you purchased it should respond in a specific way to some other chemical. You combine them and see if you get the expected result, and that is kind of an independent confirmation that the documentation is true. But yes, you do have to confirm in all cases that what you receive is what you had expected to receive, and the evaluation of the purchase order is to confirm that what you asked for was what you really need to ask for. will this process require that material specifications be on the PO, not on a material order selection document? Not necessarily, but the person doing the review has to have access to all documents that contain the information, and the people to whom you're issuing a purchase order have to have access to the identical same information. So if you're telling me that the information that fully defines the solutions or standards, certified reference materials or whatever that you're trying to buy, that defining information is distributed across several documents, all that is inconvenient, so long as the person who is reviewing the technical content before the purchase order is issued has access to all that information, and then the person to whom the order is given that has to supply it has access to the exact same information. I don't see it as a problem. Okay, here's a question. COAs on some unique standards do not come with a statement of NIST traceability. What is expected in such a case? There are some standards for which traceability has not been established by traditional means. Traceability, if you look at the NIST website, and you can find the link to this on the PGLA website, NIST defines 6 specific steps that have to be satisfied in order to support a claim of traceability. When traceability in that traditional sense is not possible, if it simply isn't available, but it's possible to get it, that's one thing. But if it isn't available because it isn't possible to obtain it by conventional means, then there are provisions in the standard under Section 5.6, measurement traceability, that traceability can be arrived at through comparison to consensus standards. That would be standards that all parties concerned have agreed to. And just keep in mind that PGLA is also an interested party. So in that instance, we would be wanting to know that and to have the opportunity to agree as well that the standards or reference materials were in fact appropriate and adequate to establish traceability. Interlaboratory comparisons of test procedures for which the standard traceability for the reference materials is not applicable can be one means of augmenting the confidence in the results that are obtained. So look at 5.6 under the section dealing with test or calibrations for which traceability cannot be strictly established in the traditional means. And you can also look at our document PL2, Perry-Johnson Laboratory Accreditation, PGLA, PL2, which is our policy on measurement traceability, and we address the issue of items that are not traceable through the traditional means. Again, there's a request for a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. As I said, it is available for download on the website. It's available for you to view on the website at any time. Next question, is it enough to say that if we review the bottles of chemicals and reagents for a particular grade against the purchase order, then the 17025 requirements for incoming inspection are met, or is actual testing required? I would say that depends on the nature of the documents. If you're getting material from an accredited testing laboratory or calibration laboratory, let's say you're getting chemical compounds or solutions that are calibrated against standard solutions. If you're getting an accredited calibration certificate for those, then you don't have to test them independently, but you do have to evaluate the certificate. And you may recall I said there's about 31 different questions that you will want to ask yourself relative to the certificate to confirm that it either has all the information it does or is required to have, or it does not. And then if it does have answers in all those areas, is the information correct and is it presented correctly? And again, that's going to be a topic of a future webinar, so keep that in mind. But the answer there is it's dependent on the nature of the organization that provided the materials and the kind of credentials they have. If it's an accredited testing or accredited calibration laboratory, then a certificate that is accurately completed and bearing evidence of traceability, either by way of a statement that is correct, not a statement that says traceable to NIST, but a statement that would say something like traceable through NIST to the system international, something like that would be acceptable. Or if it has the accreditation body accreditation logo on the certificate, the standard says that constitutes sufficient evidence of traceability. But if it is not an accredited organization, then whether or not simply accepting the documentation would satisfy the requirement, I would have to know what it is. I'd have to know more information. But I would say in all likelihood it might not. Okay, that is all the questions that I had up to shortly after 1:50. If there are any others, again, please email them to the website email address, which is on your screen, webinar@pjlabs.com. We'll monitor that pretty closely for the next little while. And if any questions come, we will try to shoot you off an answer as quickly as possible. I appreciate your attendance today. And I look forward to joining with you again on the 28th of this month at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a Tuesday. And we will conduct and present the webinar again on measurement traceability, which again is a very critical issue in testing and calibration laboratories. Thank you for your participation and hope to talk to you soon. Goodbye.